Mille grazie per questa presentazione e per l'invito qui in questo convegno interessante. Come sentono subito my mother tongue, mia lingua materna è tedesca. Mi rincresce molto che non posso parlare in tedesco qui, tutto sarebbe meglio per me, come loro capiscono tutti capiscono il tedesco. Ho dovuto scegliere per mia presentazione fra italiano e inglese. E che cosa ho scelto? L'inglese perché anche il traduttore era più disponibile. Avevo al mano qualcuno che viene dall'Africa del Sud. Allora devo leggere il mio testo, penso che il testo è perfetto, soltanto la pronunciazione come in italiano è piuttosto debole, allora ho dovuto scegliere fra due debolezze. Questa è una situazione molto umana. Come lei ha detto, questo testo è stato già distribuito, ma normalmente non si legge, si prende il tempo. Così,
il germanico.
Almeno io leggo quello che loro hanno letto e poi ho almeno aggiunto alcune immagini. Ok, I have been asked to talk about the question of Swiss-German identity during the 19th and the 20th centuries. What is of interest, therefore, is the collective, not the original individual conception of oneself in relation to other collectives. Attempts to present this collective identity, however, face a challenge. On the one side, the point is to describe the objective situation. On the other side, the point is to assess the meaning that the presentation of oneself could have. Concretely, collective identity in the sense of positioning oneself is only possible in combination with representations of relationship to others. In our case, this is the relationship of the German part of Switzerland to three other collectives. Firstly, it is the neighbors, to its neighbors who use not exactly the same language, but about the same language, namely Germany and Austria. Secondly, to the confederés, i confederati in the same federal state who use other languages. And thirdly, to the world in general, that is, the world as such. A description of these relationships inevitably remains rather general. As a result, there is a real risk that it is not possible to convincingly clarify the concrete meaning of these relationships for the so-called identity. The identity of German speakingness, to the extent that it really exists, competes with other even stronger identities of a rather individual kind, determined by age, gender, parenting, profession, religion, sports, interests, and so on. I think often we overestimate national identity. And amongst the cultural aspects, there is also the question whether there is a specific German way to think about identity and to feel it, parallel to the way in which the German Christmas tree or the German word of Gemütlichkeit are nearly exclusive. is the need to have an identity equal in Italy than in Germany? Where are the differences? And France and so on. In addition, it could also be of general interest to establish in which moments representation of identity play a role at all. That is, when are these representations of identity articulated and employed in order to have a feeling of belonging or to set oneself apart? Let's turn now to the first set of relationships that are important to the identity of the German part of Switzerland, namely the relationships to its German-speaking neighbors in the 19th and 20th centuries. The relationship to Austria was rather unimportant. For purposes of this presentation, I limit myself to the formula that is typical for this non-relationship, namely that the two countries lived back to back, how it is illustrated by this picture. But even if you insist on a non-relationship, this is also a kind of relationship, of course, if you miss something. In the relationship to Austria, it was the much earlier relationship to the House of Habsburg that was of greater significance. By the 14th century, at the latest, the Habsburgs were a real enemy to the Confederate. Later, since the 16th century, the House of Habsburg served as only or imagined enemy. Imagined enemies are sometimes even more important than real enemies. The early enemy relationship to the Habsburgs provided important identity elements in the construction of the Swiss creation myth, as you know, for example, William Tell, an element which remains alive in Switzerland till today. Compared to Austria, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the relationship to Germany was more important. To the Germany of 1848, as well as to the Germany of 1871, and of later moments up to 1945. The presentation cannot cover all of this, and anyway, research on this relationship to Germany at these historic points is still limited. Hence I will restrict myself to a few quick remarks. In brief, the progressive nationalism of the liberal international assumed that everyone is a brother and sometimes a sister too. These fraternal bonds were considered particularly strong amongst those who use the same language, but they also bound people together across language borders. But I don't know how these different nations communicated each other, which were the language knowledge in the 19th century. It was a fraternity rather abstract and not practiced concretely. Such cross-linguistic fraternity was expressed, as you can see, in the tricolor flags that were, in principle, very similar. That was important. While fraternity among speakers of the same language is expressed in the famous 1846 declaration of the Swiss national author Gottfried Keller, who, like many others too, had spent many years in Germany, Munich, Heidelberg, Berlin. he sat down on the Rhine border, looked from there into neighboring Germany, and sent emphatic greetings to the so-called second homeland. His commitment? Here, in this quiet spot, he is, quote, allowed to be Swiss and at the same time also German. That this transnational bond was still not yet obvious is evident from the formulation that he could express this connection, I quote, undisturbed and unknown in this quiet spot, not on the public area. We can stay with Gottfried Keller if we want to register an important change in the relationship to Germany in the following years. After the founding of the German Reich in 1871, Keller called out to a German professor of medicine, probably in view of the recently annexed Alsace, quote, tell the Germans that then when they finally live under a constitution which can also bear diverse constituents, the time might come in which Swiss might again return to the Kaiser and the Reich. Imagine that. Keller's declaration is, by the way, not only evidence of linguistic identity, it is also evidence of constitutional patriotism as advocated in our times by Jürgen Habermas, amongst others. Keller's second declaration after the founding of the German Reich reflected two tendencies. The first tendency is a certain sense of superiority. This arises from the fact that, as a Swiss, one had brought something about in 1848 which the Germans had failed at. This old sense of democratic superiority could unfold again in a century later, after World War II. In 1945, it included material aid and lessons in democracy in the context of German re-education programs. With some missionary zeal, to which we will return later, Swiss traveled through Western Germany and held lectures in civil education. The second tendency, evident to Keller's comment after the founding of the German Reich, is the defensive need of a smaller and democratic structure to set itself apart from its large and not very democratic neighbor. But over the following years, there were fluctuations in this boundary drawing. Between 1890 and 1914, distancing from the Reich declined in the German part of Switzerland. And during this period of economic success, Germany was perceived as a cultural example to be emulated. In these times, unconstrained Germanophilia covered over earlier reservations towards Germany, and the successful German neighbor was accepted as a civilizing and cultural leader. This approval was similar to the way in which Europe in the 1950s admired the USA. This enthusiasm for things German had the effect that it shifted somewhat into the background the question about the distinctive own being of the German part of Switzerland. But this only lasted till counter-movements to this identification with Germany re-emerged. To this enthusiasm, in the years before 1914, that the German parts of Switzerland displayed to the outside Germany, is also relevant for the second set of relationships, namely the Swiss confederés and confederati on the inside, who spoke other languages. In brief, the period of Germanophilia to the outside contributed to some difference to the French parts of Switzerland. More precisely, the difference between the German and the French parts of Switzerland that had already intensified before 1914 turned into a veritable French, a so-called fossé, with the outbreak of the First World War. This was because these two larger parts of the country each sympathized with the two Western enemies, Germany and France, in opposing ways. As an extreme voice, this is an illustration of the time of the two parts of Switzerland. As an extreme voice of the German part of Switzerland, the St. Galler Tagblatt, for example, cast this contrast in terms of racial struggle, ein Rassenkampf. The newspaper expected that in the ongoing two-front war, Switzerland would side with the Germans. On the one front, against the enemies of the East, the slaves, and on the second front, against the enemies in the West, the Romance peoples. This is relevant to our question about identity, in that the opposition on Helvetic territory was a reproduction of the continental opposition, an opposition that was understood as an ethnic racial conflict in which Teutonic Germanishness confronted Romanceness. In this polarity, various ascriptions were at play. From the Germanic perspective, a positively connoted masculinity of the Germanic peoples was claimed, as a contrast to the negatively understood femininity of the Romance peoples. Such typecasting of European peoples has today largely evaporated, as has the tendency to typify the members of the various parts of Switzerland. But what still remains, though, is interest in the question whether clearly distinct attitudes among the various parts of Switzerland can be observed in the results of general votes, the plebiscites. I jump up to the present, 92, the vote about the joining the European Economic Area, EEA. Whereas rural areas, as you can see in the German part of Switzerland, were against joining the electorate from the French part of Switzerland, here in blue, as well, and that is also important, the cities in the German part were in favor of joining EEA. How can this difference be explained? The search for answers on this question again ended up with identity as explanation and with the ascription of different collective characters. German speakers versus French speakers, conservative versus progressive, open versus closed, pragmatic versus idealistic. In Italy, it is justified to ask about the relationship of the German to the Italian part of Switzerland. These relationships are complex and cannot quickly be brought to the point. Often, the cipher of Latin Switzerland arises which groups together the similarities between the Romance languages. However, in reality, the two Swiss Latin sisters of Switzerland also live back to back. I have not a picture for that, but a picture how it is represented. The German speaking and the French speaking, they look also different television. And so it is rather a more practical closeness between the Italian and the German parts of Switzerland. Lucerne, for example. Lucerne, Ticino are closer than Ticino and Lausanne sometimes. Regarding the relationship of the Italian part of Switzerland to its Italian-speaking neighbors, Ticino to this day still has a split relationship. But here, you probably don't know this sculpture, it is in nella stazione di Chiasso, le due sorelle negli anni 30 per una esposizione universale a Milano. Io non so mai chi è la Svizzera e chi è l'Italia. Si può discutere. Allora, I have to go back to my English. Culturally, closeness is nurtured. Politically, distance, even rejection is practiced. I ticinesi non vogliono diventare membro dell'Unione Europea perché non vogliono essere esposti dell'Italia. La relazione verso l'Italia è molto importante per il comportamento verso l'Unione Europea. Loro votano sempre contro tutto perché sono contro l'Italia, gli italiani svizzeri. Closing off the topic of the relationship of German part of Switzerland to the confederati, it is worth noting the attitude towards pluriculturalism. In the German parts of Switzerland, pluriculturalism is limited to considering only the two larger portions of Switzerland, namely the French and the German section. The Italian part is often forgotten in this discourse of pluriculturalism. It is mostly not considered, not even to mention, of course, the fourth part, the Rhaeto-Romanian homelands. Let's return then to the third variant, the relationship of German Switzerland to the world in general, that is, to the world as such. Here we come closer to the title of my paper, namely the task that Switzerland took upon itself to serve as a model to the rest of the world, and how being a small state impacted on the international dimensions of its identity. In Switzerland in particular, on the German part of Switzerland, there is an ongoing discourse about the idea whether, or even more, that Switzerland is an exception in the world, a Sonderfall, a term which is also used in the French part, le Sonderfall. There are even complete books about Swiss exceptionalism. Not only political books, but also scholarly developed books about that. Obviously, exception is interpreted positively. Of course, the Swiss exceptionism is only a positive thing, and had nothing to do, for example, with dirty money or with egoistic offshore mentality. In more recent times, there has been some acknowledgement that other states, societies, are exceptions too. However, what nevertheless persists is that people now hold on to the view that Switzerland is an exceptional exception. The claim about Swiss exceptionalism goes to two directions. Firstly, against mass immigration, because the influx of migrants is considered to jeopardize Swiss uniqueness. Secondly, against membership of large associations, such as the United Nations or the European Union. This is not mine, sorry.
Switzerland. Pane e
I
cioccolato.
think that Switzerland is protested against my Okay. I start with this. The Sonderfall is clear, and now
you are okay at Switzerland.
This
You are okay.
The already mentioned project of 1992 that Switzerland would become a member of the European Economic Area was contested less with the concept of identity than with the emphasis on Swiss exceptionality, and of course also with arguments about the smallness of the country. For a small society like the Swiss one, in terms where people still strongly held on to the Bible up in the 16th century, it was obviously that the Swiss too thought of themselves as a chosen people, like the people of Israel. Being a chosen people included that Switzerland would take upon itself the task of ensuring that ideal conditions hold its way at last one small spot in the world. This image, visualize. It's important that you see that. It visualized the normal enthusiasm for the creation without appealing to any special values. And this has been produced in recent years, but we have also another example. Sorry, I'm happy to show you that already in the 16th century, Switzerland was understood by a scholar from Austria, half Austria, half Swiss in the 16th century. Nationalities, citizenships were of no importance. But he lived in Switzerland, and he presented Switzerland in this way, and you can see that the center from the outside of the world has also to have a center inside. And in our understanding, this could be the Gotthard, you know probably, as the main mountain, but here it is the Rigi. It's strange, but it is like that, and so it is understood as a center of the world. So maps and postcards to express something about identity. I can add an example, Switzerland postcard during in the First World War. So outside world is a very dangerous one. It is. You understand this. Seeing oneself as an exclusive center of the European world is not possible without concrete achievements and without recourse to specific structures. Structures which, once they exist, tend to reinforce themselves. One such achievement in Swiss relations to the world as such was that Switzerland made itself available as an international center for service provisions. This started towards the end of the 19th century in competition with two other small states, Belgium and Netherlands. A service provider to the world, Switzerland became as territory. You know it after Solferino by the creation of the Red Cross, but it is the International Committee of Red Cross in 1963. But we have other institutions, as you can read it probably, the International Telecommunication Union, already in the 19th century, the Universal Postal Union, the United International Bureau, and so on. This development continued, so to say, in the 20th century, as other similar organizations were added, the League of Nations in 1920,
Alles kaputt.
Kaputskaya pravda.
Ja.
Sono stati belgi. Fellai, dai, sei 85.
Pravda, russisch Wahrheit. Kaputskaya pravda.
So, we stopped with the League of Nations from Geneva, domiciled in 1920, then after the Second World War, the European headquarters of the United Nations. In the ensuing years, numerous further organizations followed. This included the World Trade Organization and so on, and we should also mention semi-private organizations like the International Olympic Committee in Lausanne and the famous FIFA in Zurich. These services that Switzerland provided to the world also include the acquisition of international organizations that are either strongly subsidized by the Swiss state or that they get some form of tax relief from the Swiss state. This is relevant to our topic of identity in as much as such state subsidies to international organizations are only possible if the majority of citizens allow them, because this commitment to international service provisions corresponds to citizens' dominant conception of themselves. Switzerland as an international institution, however, does this reality and self-conception impact on Swiss collective identity? And how can one find the answer to this question? Fortunately, the Swiss system of direct democracy gives us some answers. Plebiscites on foreign policy give us insight into how Swiss voters relate to this view of Switzerland. Plebiscites show a gap in the German and Italian parts of Switzerland, not however in the French parts, between the taking in consideration of the real connection to the world and the strong tendency of self-isolationism. On the one hand, there are the concrete interconnections to the world through the mentioned international institutions. On the other hand, there is a decided need to separate and to draw boundaries. Yet, at the same time, there is also a feeling of missionary consciousness, as feeling that it is one's duty to be a model to the world and that one should also broadcast this example to others. The self-imposed missionary obligation is hardly immodest, of course, and I'm sure that Swiss are in general not happy if their model is realized by others, because the uniqueness will disappear. Drawing on publications like this one of the late 1960s, I distinguish between a political mission and an unpolitical mission. Even for me, everything is political as a man of 68. But it's clear we can make this distinction. Using this distinction, one aspect of the Swiss political mission is to set a republic example in a monarchic environment. Think again Gottfried Keller's message to the German professor. Another aspect of the political mission is the national self-understanding. This rests on the will of Swiss people to belong together and not on a shared language and common bloodlines. In this sense, Switzerland posits and idealizes itself for others as a peaceful multinational state en miniature. The unpolitical Swiss mission is the humanitarian one, as exemplified by the Red Cross. Other aspects of the unpolitical mission include mediation in international conflicts with good services and possibly also with provision of asylum. Here, this postcard shows this humanitarian mission, also a postcard produced in the First World War. A precondition of this unpolitical humanitarian mission is neutrality, something else for which Switzerland is also considered exemplary. Just imagine the Swiss argument goes if everyone were natural and had an army only for self-defense, then conflicts amongst states would cease to exist. However, from the perspective of identity, neutrality is a complex category. This is because neutrality allows a form of existence that is neither nor. One could almost say an existence as non-existence. Although, to be precise regarding Swiss neutrality, it has to be said that during the Cold War, Switzerland was undoubtedly and without problem only a Western neutral state. Furthermore, when the media, national days or world exhibitions turn neutrality into a dogmatic identity construct, this raises the question: to what extent does such a dogmatic identity centered on neutrality initiate and guide action? And to what extent does such a dogmatic neutrality actually hinder actions? I have an occasion expressed I become tired. I have on occasion expressed the assumption that a small society like Switzerland asks the question, who are we? More strongly or differently than larger countries. I don't know how often Italians ask themselves who they are as Italians. And correspondingly, such a small country also asserts its identity more strongly or differently than larger ones. One feature of the assertion of identity by small states such as Switzerland is that one likes being told by non-Swiss how they see Switzerland. However, it must be noted that if this form of identity assertion includes the wish to also receive some critical reflection from the outside, this does not work. In the rule, the so-called outside perspective reproduces the positive auto-stereotypes of the inside perspective. And anyway, descriptions of identity generally limit themselves to the foregrounding of positive traits. To conclude, allow me a few general comments about the topic of relation to language. I don't know, I could stop here. Have I 5 more minutes?
5.
6?
Too much.
7?
Five.
Let's see.
Too much.
Okay. Our conference has prompted 2 questions for me that I had not previously considered. Firstly, can we distinguish types of identities and discourse about identity that correspond to different nations or language regions? And secondly, are there countries that joined the identity discourse earlier? A discourse that in the meantime has become a nearly universal transnational phenomenon. Considering the later question, I propose the following short history of discourse of identity. And you see, by this documentation, one did not always speak about identity. Even if there were identities in the 19th century, we speak about self-consciousness, but the Google documentation showed how strongly this went up in the 80s. Regarding this history of the notion of identity, it must be emphasized, if one does not want to lose oneself in essentialism and normative ideas, the only academically justifiable engagement with identity, whether individual or collective, Swiss or not Swiss, would be restricted to the question why, when and how is identity claimed. Regarding to the question why, besides self-affirmation, the identity discourse has a double function. To this insight, it ensures a certain acculturation of those fellow citizens who are added or by birth or by immigration. To the outside, the function of identity discourse is to manifest one's own existence, also through drawing boundaries, mental boundaries. Regarding the question, when the rise of identity discourse of the 80s that boomed in other parts of the world also captured Switzerland. If others nurtured an identity, one should also have oneself an identity. This rise of identity discourse in Switzerland was also reflected in my own academic biography. In 1985, I became the director of a national research program funded with 15 million Swiss francs called Cultural Diversity and National Identity. I must confess that during our initial activities I experienced a double skepticism. Firstly, because it was not really clear what identity was supposed to mean. Secondly, because it was not very plausible that one should spend such an enormous amount of money on investigating this topic. The early 80s was also the time in which scholars from Germany entered the identity discourse and contributed to its popularity. In '85, the well-known German political theorist Werner Weidenfeld published the collection of essays about European identities. This is after he had, in '83, already published a book about the identity of the Germans. While identity had still been a foreign concept at the start of 1980s, probably not only in Switzerland, in that years that followed, it became a generally accepted currency. By the late 80s, the term identity was being used so often and at such an inflationary pace that Lutz Niethammer convincingly called it a plastic concept. Notwithstanding Niethammer's criticism of the notion of identity, he paradoxically still found it appropriate to write a book about it, a book of just about 1,000 pages thick, about a practice that was largely an empty, but is nonetheless, or even therefore, a very useful cipher. Thank you for your attention.